يعتبر المؤلف من أهم الباحثين في مجال التاريخ الإسلامي. له أبحاث عدة في علاقات إنجلترا بالعالم الإسلامي عبر التاريخ.
Hello, my name is Professor Jerry Broughton. I work at the University of London at Queen Mary. And for many, many decades now, I've been working on relations between early 16th and 17th century England and the Islamic world. Very broadly, I talk about the Islamic world because of so many different connections between England and different Muslim empires and kingdoms in this period. I started doing this work in the late 1990s. And what really, I think, transformed that kind of work and the importance of that work for me were the events of 9/11 and subsequently also the events in London in 7/7. And the attacks, both in terms of America and the UK, which for me seemed to crystallize certain problem around Western responses to the Islamic world. The Islamophobia, which obviously developed and intensified throughout that period, was always there. I'd been growing up in the north of England, in Bradford, a town which had a very significant Muslim community. I grew up with Muslims, with Sikhs, with Hindus, as well as Christians and people of no faith as well. It was a very multicultural but very tense period of time. So as a scholar, as an academic, I'd always been interested in those longer connections between what we might call, certainly in the earlier periods, in the 16th and 17th century, Christianity and Islam. Generally also might be referred to as connections between East and West, although I've always found those distinctions to be rather unhelpful because of some notion that's created, of course, in the Anglo-American world of the East. The East can sort of seem to mean anything that's just east of Europe right through to China and Japan. So I don't think it's a very helpful term to talk about East and West. But in the period I was looking at, I was interested to see that there's a different story from the one that we hear today about the supposed clash of civilizations, an argument which I also have a lot of problems with, and I think that that's very politically loaded. But that what you hear in this period, particularly in the 16th century, is a very different story about relations between Christianity and Islam. And my particular interest was in the relationship between Elizabethan England, so the period from 1570, which is very significant, which I'll talk about in a minute, to around 1603, when Queen Elizabeth I dies. She comes to the throne even earlier. She comes to the throne in 1558. So it's really the second half of the 16th century is very important. And the book that I wrote about this was to look at the way in which Elizabethan England had a very close and actually very friendly relationship with various Muslim kingdoms at this time. So that story is one that I tell in a book that I wrote in 2016 called This Orient Isle, Elizabethan England and the Islamic World. And I'll talk a bit about the reception of the book because of how people, particularly in the English-speaking world, responded to it in some interesting ways. But let me first talk really about the history of this period. So if we put it within a wider context, we know that obviously there's a connection between Christians and Muslims that goes right back to the 7th, 8th century with the foundations of Islam, with the period of the Crusades, and then through into a period that in the West we refer to as the Renaissance, really 15th, 16th century Europe, which is also a period when, again, there are encounters with the Islamic world, very specifically at that time, the Ottoman Empire. So when the Ottoman Emperor Mehmet II captures Constantinople, now of course called Istanbul, in 1453, that's a hugely significant moment in global history because of the shift in geopolitics and also religious power in the period. that the Ottomans and Islam then has Constantinople, one of the great seats of Eastern Roman Christianity. And that for Europe changes everything, really, I think, within the politics, within the culture, within the literature, within the intellectual thought of this whole period. So that's one of the contexts. And really, by the early 16th century, there is a sense in which the Ottoman Empire is the great empire. There are European Christian empires, specifically the Spanish, what's known as the Spanish Habsburg Empire. Also the Portuguese Empire, because the Portuguese, by this point, have trade routes into the Far East, around the Cape of Good Hope. They are in India. They're trading in the Indian Ocean. But both the Spanish and the Portuguese are very aware that the larger imperial power in this period is Islamic, and it is the Ottomans. The English and the Tudors, who are the dynasty that rules England from the late 15th century, are minor players. So we think very much about the British Empire much later in the 18th and 19th century. But in the late 15th, early 16th century, England is not part of the imperial geopolitical world picture. It's not important. What's important is Portugal, Spain, and the Islamic Ottoman empires, and also Persia. China, of course, is a great empire in its own right, but isn't really involved. There is no exchange and connections as such at this point. So it's really those three great empires, Portugal, Spain, and the Ottomans at this time, all vying for power in the Eastern Mediterranean, the trade routes into Southeast Asia, and in the Indian Ocean. One of the other interesting things that happens theologically within Christianity is the Reformation. So in 1517, Martin Luther, a German monk, protests against what he sees as Catholic abuses. So at the time, the Catholic Church based in Rome is all-powerful. Luther challenges that, protests against the fact that he sees examples of corruption, he sees idolatry, he's not very happy with the way in which religious practice is working, so he protests against it. That then builds into a huge conflict within the Catholic Christian Church. There's a split, as many people will know, there's a split between Protestants and Catholics, led by Luther, but also other theologians, people like Calvin, also taking a Protestant position. What this does in the period is very significant, because it means that Christianity is split. And also it's looking at Islam and it's thinking that Islam is quite a unified religion. It doesn't really understand the theological distinctions between Sunni and Shia, but it is aware that Persia and the Ottoman empires are very powerful. And so what you start to get are interesting alliances, because some Protestant theologians and even some Protestant princes start saying, well, we have been defined as heretics by the Catholic Church in Rome. The other so-called heresy in the period, as far as the Catholics are concerned, is Islam. So Islam is not understood properly in this period as a theology in its own right. So Catholicism that fears Islam, it fears its imperial power, it doesn't understand its theology. So it simply dismisses it, inaccurately of course, as a heresy, a heretical offshoot of Judaism and Christianity. Protestantism therefore says, well, we are being referred to as heretics by Catholics, and Islam is also referred to as a heresy. Perhaps there could be strategically an alliance that we make with the Ottomans particularly, but other Islamic states. And that is indeed what happens throughout the 16th century. The French from the 1520s are making alliances with the Ottomans to create a united front against Spanish imperial aggression. So what then happens when in England, when Queen Elizabeth I comes to the throne in 1558, is she is a particularly small, isolated Protestant ruler of a Protestant state in England, isolated from not all, but most of Europe. Most of Europe remains Catholic, particularly Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, Portugal. Germany, slightly different because of theologians like Luther, is split between Protestant areas and Catholic areas. And Holland, as it is today, predominantly Protestant as well. So Elizabeth is very isolated, and she's very aware that Catholic Spain wants to crush Protestantism in England. So what does she do? Well, one of the things that she does is she starts to formalize an alliance with the Muslim kingdoms of North Africa, or the Maghreb, particularly in modern-day Morocco, the Barbary states, as some of you will know it as. Also with Persia. So from the 1550s and 1560s, she's sending out English diplomats and merchants to Persia in the 1560s. And also, most significantly, for my history, is the connection with the Ottoman Empire. So in the early years of Elizabeth's rule, there are already English merchants who are privately trading, particularly with North Africa, particularly through Fez in modern-day Morocco. Also, some connections in the Eastern Mediterranean informally with the Ottomans. But it hasn't really been politically formalized. A big moment is in 1570, because in 1570, Elizabeth I is officially excommunicated. She's kicked out of the Catholic Church. The Pope passes an act formally excommunicating her. This really creates much more political and religious tension in the period, because England is now seen as a pariah state. Very interesting in terms of thinking about those debates today, because by 1570, England was seen as a renegade state, a dangerous renegade state. Elizabeth's response throughout the 1570s is to start building alliances with Islam. So from 1578, she starts to send English representatives to Istanbul. One particularly important figure, a merchant called William Harborne, who goes, presents his credentials to the Ottoman Sultan, Murad III, and says, I come as a supplicant state. We know that you are a greater power, and my queen wishes to do business with you. Murad doesn't really know about Elizabeth, doesn't really know about England, because it's just such a minor player. It's a tiny island up in northwestern Europe. It's not of interest to Murad. He's interested in Persia, in China, in the Spanish, in the Portuguese. But he says, okay, we'll do a deal with you. And from 1579, Elizabeth starts writing extremely friendly letters, formal letters of alliance to Murad. These letters have survived. They build up a diplomatic correspondence throughout the 1580s. And it is quite fascinating, because what it starts to do is show also a theological connection between the two empires. Elizabeth writes to Murad and says, we, like you, are people of the book. We do not believe in religious intercession. We do not believe in the worship of idols. We do not believe in saints. Now, Elizabeth's advisors, I think, are telling her these connections. I don't think that Elizabeth, for instance, is very versed in Islamic theology, but nevertheless, she and her advisors have some theological understanding that there is superficially a connection between the two faiths, between Protestantism and, in the case of the Ottomans, Sunni Muslim belief. Harborne arrives in Istanbul in 1579-1580, and he then sets up a commercial alliance between the Ottomans and the English, which lasts until 1922. This is an extraordinary alliance. It gives Englishmen preferential trading rights in Ottoman territories. It establishes a rather informal military alliance. And what it amazingly leads to is an import-export trade where the English merchants, with Elizabeth's agreement, are shipping munitions, they're shipping weapons to the Ottomans, because the Ottomans at this point are fighting not only in Persia, but also the Spanish in the Mediterranean. So Protestant English weapons are being used by Ottoman armies to attack not only Persia, but also other Christians. So this is a remarkable aspect of this alliance and connection between Protestantism and Islam. And it thrives throughout the 1580s and 1590s. Elizabeth and Murad exchange very amicable letters. Again, Elizabeth absolutely accepts Murad's sovereignty, says he is the greater imperial power. She's very grateful for the alliance, and it helps her build an alliance against Spain. Now, at this point, I think that the connections are very, what you might call political. There isn't some sense of an attempt to have theological understanding and engagement. But what interested me when I was doing my research is how that developed. Because what that means is when you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of English men and increasingly some women who are working and living in Muslim communities all the way from North Africa right through to the Ottoman territories towards Syria in modern day Turkey and throughout the Mediterranean, you're getting people who are starting to learn and understand different beliefs, different ideologies, coming to some accommodation with Islamic belief and vice versa. So this is fascinating. I have examples from the 1580s of English merchants who were also converting to Islam. Some are forcible conversions, but some clearly are open conversions because it seems to me at this time, English Protestantism doesn't think it might survive. It therefore looks at Islam. It sees a very powerful and very unified kingdom under the Ottomans with a very clear theological belief system. And I think many, particularly Englishmen, convert because they see that that is a good thing to do. Now, that goes on throughout the 1580s, 1590s. You get an extraordinary exchange of goods, of ideas, because the English are delighted because they're getting all the wonderful exotic trade all the way through from China, silks, spices, all these wonderful things that flow into England through the Ottoman territories with the agreement of the Ottomans. You also have from North Africa, you have Moroccan merchants who visit England, climaxing in an extraordinary visit in 1600 by a representative of the Barbary states called Muhammad al-Anouri. And al-Anouri comes and he lives in London for 6 months. He's celebrated as a very significant figure. He builds a diplomatic alliance with Elizabeth and then returns. Elizabeth dies in 1603, and it brings to an end a certain moment where these two cultures meet, trade, exchange ideas, talk about their beliefs in a quite open way, which is nothing like the kind of antagonism that we see today. It tells you a very different story. It has many impacts. One impact is on the literature and the drama of the period. We always think of the Tudors as an exclusively white, Christian, cultural tradition and a ruling dynasty. This is simply not true. So the Elizabethan stage, which most famously produces Shakespeare from the 1580s, is absolutely full of figures and characters and settings which we could now call Islamic. This culminates in the end with Shakespeare's great play Othello, which is published in 1604. We usually date it a bit earlier. I think it's intimately connected to the visit of Muhammad al-Anouri in 1600, and Shakespeare depicts a figure called a Moor, a synonym, another word for Muslim. So the word Muslim and also the word Islam does not enter the English language until the 1610s, 1620s, but there are various synonyms, other words for Muslims. So Moors, Turks, Saracens, Ottomites, Ottomans, all these different terms are reflecting Elizabeth's alliance with the Islamic world in this period. And the stage reflects that. Christopher Marlowe's plays similarly stage various figures, historical figures, accurate historical figures from the Islamic world. Shakespeare has Moors. He also talks a lot about Turks. There is clearly a reflection about the way in which English Protestantism and Islam has at this moment become allied, and actually it's an enduring one which makes connections between politics, religion, and trade. Now, Elizabeth dies in 1603, and much of that relationship tends to fade away to some extent. The Ottoman sultans to some extent more concerned with Persia. The ruler of the Barbary states, Al-Mansur, also dies around the same time. So things change, things shift, and the alliance is not as powerful and profound as it was. Nevertheless, I think really from around 1560, let's say, once Elizabeth is in power, through to 1603, there is a remarkable encounter between these two cultures. And it's an encounter which I wanted to tell the story of very much in our current moment, in the early 21st century, to challenge certain myths and stereotypes about the way in which Islam and Christianity has encountered each other over time. It has changed over time. And really the problem that we've had in the intervening period is, of course, imperialism. So the way in which British imperialism operated, particularly in the late 18th and particularly the 19th and early 20th century, was to create a language, a discourse, which the great Palestinian critic Edward Said called Orientalism. The way in which you categorized the East, as he put it, and particularly Islamic cultures, as backward, unscientific, despotic. And this was a myth, this was a stereotype that was created very much in terms of British imperial ideology and French imperial ideology. And this is a story which is simply one that we need to revise strongly. I think Said's argument was very important, and it allowed us to say, well, actually, it's a myth. And also, historically, there were different moments where the two cultures encountered each other. And one moment was in this period that I'm looking at in the 16th century, because it's so important, I think, for English national ideology. And people have responded in some very different ways around the book. I think a lot of white English historians are appalled by this, can't quite believe it, but it's there in the records. And one of the great moments for me is being able to go to mosques, including the Haram Mosque in London, to talk about this history, to say we can tell a different story about the way in which our two faiths have come together over time.